Thank you for coming over. It was really fun following all the tech and VC guys. They're all wearing jeans. And we're the last vestige in the Middle East here, bankers wearing suits, even bankers, Goldman Sachs in New York, have gone casual. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to raise money in the Middle East and the differences between investors in the Middle East, in the GCC primarily, compared to investors from the West. The company I'm with is Greenstone Equity Partners. We are specializing in placements. We have offices throughout the GCC, in every major GCC city. We've been doing it for approximately 9 years. The points I'm going to cover is just, number one, why the GCC? It's when you're a New York or California fund manager, or fund manager from Hong Kong or Shanghai, it's a long flight, 12, 13-hour flight, 9, 8-hour time difference. It is a small market. There are 5 real major countries, plus Bahrain. There are cultural differences, language differences. A lot of large funds who have every significant fund oversubscribed don't feel that it makes sense to come here, but there's some advantages to coming here. Number one, there's substantial untapped capital, especially on the level below the sovereign wealth funds. Investors are undercovered. Most of the funds, to the extent that they come to this region, work with what we call the usual suspects, the top sovereign wealth funds. There are a lot of investors below that level that are undercovered. There is more alternative investment per capita here in this region than pretty much any other region, and that's valuable and helpful. The bigger reason is LP diversification. It makes a lot of sense to have a wider LP base so that recession type of storms, to the extent they're not fully correlated, can be weathered. And as funds are growing, Fund 4, $1 billion, Fund 5, $2.5 billion, Fund 6, $4 billion, Fund 7, $9 billion. In that growth environment, increasing the LP base is critically important to fund managers. The usual suspects. These are the sovereign wealth funds, government-owned entities. There's 32 listed on the slide. What ends up happening is a lot of the larger sovereigns invest $50 million and up. There are 4 sovereign wealth funds that invest $100 million and up. So the tickets are very large. It's relatively easier, even though it takes up to 6 months to get a ticket, to get a commitment from a very large investor, sovereign wealth fund. These are the entities. These 32 are the ones that get covered primarily. We call them the usual suspects. When we talk to fund managers from all over the world, they have inroads, they've had conversations with the largest sovereign wealth funds. What is not covered, sometimes totally not covered, and a lot of times undercovered by fund managers and outside the area placement firms, are the non-institutional investors on the conventional side and almost the entire Sharia compliance investor space. A lot of the funds have shied away from Sharia compliance structuring. It has been incredibly difficult. It was very expensive. It took time, but most importantly, it changed the way the fund managers had to employ their strategies, and that was just not really attractive. Things have changed recently. So there's a significant amount of capital that is untapped and that is undercovered. If you look at the breakdown of the investors by country, throughout, non-institutional investors are around 80% of the market versus institutional investors. The ticket sizes, of course, change. These are typical ticket sizes into alternative funds, and the sovereign wealth funds are at the top of the scale. If you look at the gray area, the non-institutional investors, the ultra-high net worths go 2 to 5 million. Tickets, family offices go 5 to 25 million. So between the larger family offices at the $25 million level and the last 5 rows in that table under institutional investors, which are undercovered, there's significant capital that can be gathered without having to go down to $1 million tickets and trying to build a book from there. The regulatory requirements have become a very, very significant issue over the last year and a half. Up till recently, up till 2017, there used to be these tolerated practices. There was no requirement for license. People didn't think there was a requirement for licensing, and the regulators did not pursue unlicensed fundraising activity. Over the last 18 months, the entire environment has changed. Every regulator is very much cognizant as to how funds are being raised. And the regulators are targeting the fund managers, opposed to the intermediaries, placement agents. And it's become a very serious issue. What the regulators are doing is telling the LPs if the fund manager did not register the fund, were not licensed in the country, they weren't represented by a licensed firm, you, the LP, can call the funds back anytime you want on a 10-year lockup fund, which is not fun for a fund manager. When an LP has the right to call their money back, it becomes very complicated with the rest of the LPs. And we asked the question, well, you're a regulator in Saudi Arabia, you're a regulator in UAE, how do you make a New York or a Hong Kong fund comply with whatever penalty and order you're issuing? And their answer was very simple. They have cooperation agreements with all the regulators throughout, and they just regulator to regulator communicate, and the local regulator is the one that enforces the decision. So this has become an issue. The licensing is nowhere near simple or close to the Western licensing. In the US, there's a broker-dealer license, takes about 3 months, $10,000. In the UK, the FC authorization for introducing takes around 6 months. These licenses, we have every single one of them. The fastest one was 3 years. The slowest one was 6 years, and no license cost under $1 million. So it's a very significant commitment to get these licenses, but they're required. And also, 3 of the primary market countries, UAE, KSA, and Kuwait, which are the largest ticket sizes in the GCC, require the funds to be registered with the local regulator, which opens up a lot of issues. But this will be more and more concern for a lot of the larger fund managers, even on re-ups. To the extent there's an LP in a fund 5 and they want to re-up for fund 6, it requires a full licensing, full registration to be able to do that. The techniques people have used, reverse solicitation, the regulators are rolling their eyes on that. Offshore document, subscription doc execution, to the extent that the fund was marketing, even a meeting was held in the country where the investor is, the regulators assume that that was marketed there and they require the full license, and they don't really care where the docs were executed. So this becomes an issue, and it's something that every fund manager should be aware of as they raise money in this region. What are the differences between Western LPs and GCC LPs? The GCC investors naturally are a little bit reticent on due diligence. When you sit in Riyadh or Kuwait City and you're investing into a fund manager, private equity manager in New York, who's purchasing companies in Texas, it is much easier for a New York pension fund or a California pension fund to due diligence the track record and actions of a New York PE that's buying US companies. Much harder for a Riyadh investor or an Abu Dhabi investor to do the same due diligence. So primarily locals, the GCC investors want to come into second or final closing. They want to follow on the local institutional investors, local to where the fund manager is, who have done the due diligence. They're startup funds, and we get approached all the time with startup funds. Very, very difficult to do. They have to have a great track record, the managers and partners. And the fund, something like half of the fund has to be raised locally before they even come here to start talking to the investors. And there has to be a unique strategy. It has to be extremely compelling for investors in this region to invest into a startup fund. As far as the due diligence goes, it requires 2 to 4 face-to-face meetings. Number of conference calls. Local investors want references of LPs, primarily institutional LPs from the region where the fund manager is. And a number of them also do site visits. They go see the manager in their own environment and check out their offices. Sharia compliance, I mentioned that before. Before we get to Sharia compliance, the pros and cons of the GCC LPs. So why do it? We're told by clients who raise money all over the world versus GCC, and they tell us that the GCC investor class, and relatively, you're comparing a GCC family office to a New York family office, GCC institutional investor to a UK institutional investor, et cetera. On a relative basis, they tell us the ticket sizes are larger in the GCC than the West. And they also tell us they're much more sticky, meaning that higher percentage of the GCC investors re-up into future funds, and they increase their ticket sizes on re-ups, is what fund managers tell us. So they're very attractive points. On the con side, it takes approximately twice as long from first meeting to commitment on a relative basis. If TIA or Texas Teachers takes 3 months to invest from first meeting to commitment, ADIA and KIA are going to take 6 months. So it's approximately double. If the Bloomberg family office is going to take 6 weeks, the Olion or Miras is going to take 12 weeks. That is a little complicated as to, we have funds especially in Silicon Valley, they're looking to open and close in 60 days, which just absolutely does not work in this region. And also there's a little bit more education necessary as to the strategy and why the strategy is a good idea and why it's the right time in the economic cycle that strategy should be utilized. And that takes a little bit more time by the fund managers to kind of go through and get the investors comfortable with that. So there are pros and cons, and the fund managers make the decision. Generally, even the largest household name, brand name fund managers who've gotten to $5, $6, $7, $9 billion fund sizes absolutely have to cover the region, especially beyond the usual suspects. Most of them have either passed for life or have maxed out in these funds, and that opens the need to be able to work with non-institutional investors. From a numbers standpoint, individual numbers standpoint, we work with around 200 institutional investors. This is about 170 of them are below the usual suspects, and around 1,500 non-institutional investors. Non-institutionals are family office and ultra-high net worths, and we won't work with anybody that's not going to put in a minimum $2 million ticket into alternative investments. So the universe is very large and huge opportunities to the extent they're covered. But the only way you can cover a regular family office, not a mega, but a regular family office, and ultra-high net worth investors is to be next to them. We try to cover them from Dubai, in Jeddah, or in Kuwait City or Doha. It's very, very difficult, almost impossible. So you have to be right down the street. They call you and say, that fund manager you brought to me last week, why don't we talk about that? Come over this afternoon. And there's no coming over this afternoon if you're in Dubai or you're in London. So we had to build a large infrastructure to cover them. It's very, very difficult to cover ultra-high net worths and family offices from afar. Sharia compliance, almost everybody knows what that is and what that means. The complication has been the last 20 years, until about a year and a half ago, the structure was available, but it caused the fund manager that's executed strategy to execute it differently, which was incredibly complicated. It's almost like running two separate funds, and that just did not make sense for the fund managers. Over the last year and a half, we worked with large law firms to structure a format with similar to a tax blocker. We have a Sharia blocker structure where the funds coming straight into the fund account for the fund manager, and the fund manager can execute the strategy identically the way they would normally execute the strategy, and the Sharia blocker makes the whole thing work, and fatwas are issued under that structure, and the Sharia boards approve them. So that has opened up an entire class of investors. Approximately 35% of the institutional investors require Sharia compliance, but almost 80% of the non-institutional investors in this region require Sharia compliant investing. So that 80% class, that 35% class, really did have very, very little choices. If you look at what has been available historically between 2000 and 2016, 2017, to investors in a Sharia-compliant manner for alternative funds, private equity firms, venture capital firms, hedge funds, infrastructure funds, et cetera, has been almost non-existent. There's almost really no good opportunity for Sharia-compliant investors to invest. And as funds become Sharia-compliant or have Sharia-compliant structures, feeders into the funds, that completely unlocks a very significant pool of capital into funds, and the funds that have taken advantage of the structuring have done incredibly well over the last 12 months in this region. Structuring takes a few weeks in this day and age, and it's very, very low, six figures, $100,000, $125,000. So it's not a big deal. The attorney law firms have figured it out. They're third-party Sharia structuring, approving entities that issue the fatwas in a manner that the Sharia boards of the investors are going to accept. So this big black box or concern of Sharia compliance has mostly been solved, which is unlocking a very large pool for investors. Lastly, for fund managers not really familiar with this region, we wanted to kind of highlight what was and what is. The visas, the only country that has a visa that takes a long time, that's not an airport-issued visa, was Saudi Arabia, until about a month ago. And 10 years ago, you couldn't get a Saudi visa if you'd ever visited Israel. American citizens had 2 passports, just a mess. These days, none of those issues exist in Saudi Arabia. We had a client, his name was Dave Israel, and no issue with getting a passport, getting in there. So the whole concept of if you visited the wrong country, you couldn't get into a country, that's just old news now. Saudi was the last country that required pre-approved visas. They got to get weeks before. Now they just announced e-visas right at the airport. So the Vision 2030 has really been accretive to Saudi Arabia, and we're very, very happy to see that. So visas are no longer an issue. Religious belief restrictions, again, Saudi used to ask the religion of the person applying for a visa, and if you put the wrong religion, there were complications about getting a visa. None of that is an issue anymore. It's just a myth at this point. And people always ask us, wait, our senior portfolio manager is a lady, our senior partner is female, is that going to be an issue? Absolutely not. It's actually never been an issue, and it certainly is not an issue today. So those are the primary concerns. Looks like I have 1 minute and 15 seconds. Our view is that it does make a lot of sense to come into this region, raise money in this region. It used to be extremely difficult. It's getting easier and easier. It still requires the local knowledge and local touch and local relationships, especially as one moves below the sovereign wealth fund level. But there's a lot of capital here that is available. It's one of the reasons why conferences like this get attended significantly. The FII in Saudi Arabia that happened about 30 days ago was incredibly well attended. Last year's 2018's FII was not attended as well by Western investors, but this year was incredible. So lots of interest, lots of capital, few things to know and learn and execute on, but we're very bullish about the capital that goes from this region into foreign alternative investments. Thank you very much.